Imagine waking up, not to an alarm clock, but to the cold, gray light filtering through a cave mouth. The smell of ash from a fire that has been kept alive for 3 days straight. And the sound of someone you love sharpening a stone tool just a few feet away. There was no clock. There was no calendar. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings built entire lives, entire rhythms, entire joys and sorrows around nothing but the sun, the seasons, and each other. We tend to picture our prehistoric ancestors as little more than grunting figures dragging clubs through the mud, surviving from one meal to the next in a constant state of fear. But the deeper researchers dig, quite literally, into the soil of ancient campsites, the more that image falls apart. What emerges instead is something far more human. A world filled with laughter around fires, with games scratched into cave walls, with music made from hollow bones, with jewelry crafted purely because it looked beautiful, and with grief so profound that the dead were buried with flowers and ochre and the tools they might need in another life. To understand this world, we have to travel back further than most of recorded history can reach. Beyond the pyramids, beyond the first cities, beyond even the invention of writing. We are heading into the Pleistocene and the early Holocene, a span of time stretching from roughly 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, when the climate lurched between bitter ice ages and brief warm interludes, and when small bands of humans, sometimes no more than 20 or 30 people, learned to survive on every continent except Antarctica. The day, for most of this immense stretch of time, did not begin with hunting or fighting for survival every waking hour, as old textbooks once suggested. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of the Kalahari, whose ways of life remain remarkably close to those of our distant ancestors, have found something surprising. These communities often spend far fewer hours each day searching for food than the average modern office worker spends commuting and working combined. Some estimates put the actual labor of hunting and gathering at somewhere between 3 and 6 hours a day. The rest of the time was filled with rest, conversation, storytelling, crafting, and play. This single fact reshapes everything we think we know about prehistoric existence. It was not, as Thomas Hobbes once famously claimed, a life that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short in every single moment. It was, for long stretches, surprisingly social and even leisurely, punctuated by genuine danger and hardship, yes, but also by deep connection and unexpected comfort. Picture an early morning in a river valley in what is now southern France, around 17,000 years ago, during the time we now associate with the painters of Lascaux. The air is sharp with cold. A small band stirs near the mouth of a limestone shelter. Children, wrapped in furs stitched together with bone needles and sinew thread, are already awake, chasing each other around boulders, laughing in a language no living person will ever hear again. An older woman, her hands roughened by decades of hide working, sits near the fire, reshaping a flint blade, striking it with quick, practiced taps that send tiny flakes spinning into the dirt. A young man checks the snares he set the evening before along a nearby thicket, hoping for a hare or a ptarmigan. This was not a single, monotonous existence repeated identically for thousands of generations. Daily life shifted dramatically depending on geography and climate. In the icy reaches of what is now Siberia, communities built shelters from mammoth bones and tusks, arranging them with surprising architectural skill, layering hides over the frames to trap precious warmth. In the warmer river deltas of Africa, where the first members of our species, Homo sapiens, emerged roughly 300,000 years ago, Shelters might be simple windbreaks of branches, since the climate demanded far less protection.
Food gathering followed the rhythm of the seasons, with an intimacy modern people have almost entirely lost. Spring might mean the arrival of migrating fish, gathered in surprising numbers using woven traps and sharpened spears. Summer often brought a flourishing of edible plants, roots, tubers, berries, and nuts, gathered primarily by women and children, whose deep botanical knowledge, passed down orally across generations, identified which plants healed, which nourished, and which could kill. Autumn was the season of preparation, when meat might be smoked or dried, when nuts were stored in pits lined with leaves, when hides were thickened and prepared for winter's brutal arrival. And in winter, especially during the depths of the last ice age, survival depended heavily on stored food, on hunting large herd animals like reindeer, bison, or horses, and on the kind of close, fire-lit togetherness that defines so much of what we now imagine when we picture cave life.
Hunting itself was rarely the dramatic solo battle against a charging beast that popular imagination so often paints. It was, more often, a coordinated, almost choreographed group effort. Hunters might spend days tracking a herd, reading footprints, droppings, and broken vegetation with extraordinary skill, before driving animals toward a natural trap, a cliff edge, a narrow ravine, or a prepared pit. Weapons evolved steadily across these millennia. Early hand-thrown spears gave way to spear throwers, devices that added incredible force and distance to a thrown weapon. And eventually, by around 20,000 years ago in some regions, to the bow and arrow, a revolutionary technology that let hunters strike from far greater distances with far greater safety.
But survival was never only about food. It was about warmth, and warmth meant fire. The mastery of fire stands as one of the single greatest turning points in the entire human story, likely controlled in some form for over 1 million years, though reliably created on demand for a much shorter span. Fire meant cooked food, which made nutrients easier to absorb and may have contributed to the very growth of the human brain. Fire meant protection from predators that once saw humans as easy prey. And fire meant light, extending into the darkness, creating hours in the evening for something that earlier hominins likely never had time for: leisure.
It is in this fire-lit darkness that some of the most extraordinary evidence of prehistoric daily life survives. Around 40,000 years ago, in caves scattered across what is now France, Spain, Indonesia, and beyond, humans began creating art with a sophistication that still astonishes researchers today. The painted horses and bison of Chauvet Cave, the hand stencils of Sulawesi, the lions and rhinoceroses rendered with shaded, almost three-dimensional musculature on the walls of Lascaux. These were not accidents or idle scratches. They required prepared pigments, mixed from ochre, charcoal, and binding agents like animal fat or plant sap. They required scaffolding to reach high ceilings. They required, in many cases, the kind of artistic training passed from a skilled hand to a younger one. Someone, in other words, was teaching.
And alongside painting came music. Flutes carved from the wing bones of vultures and swans, discovered in caves in present-day Germany and dated to over 40,000 years ago, prove that prehistoric humans deliberately crafted instruments capable of producing distinct musical notes. Rhythmic drumming on hollow logs or stretched hides likely accompanied dances whose steps are lost to time, but whose social function we can guess at. Bonding a group together, marking a successful hunt, honoring the birth of a child, or easing the grief of losing one.
Games, too, left their fingerprints across the ancient world. Small carved bones and stones found at sites across Europe and Asia smoothed by repeated handling, suggests something like dice or counting games. Some archaeologists believe simple board-like games using pebbles and scratched grids on flat stones may stretch back tens of thousands of years, long before anything resembling the formal board games of early civilizations, like Senet in ancient Egypt or the royal game of in Mesopotamia. Children almost certainly played versions of tag, wrestling, and imitation games, mimicking the hunting and gathering behaviors of the adults around them, a form of play that doubled as essential survival education.
Clothing, far from being a crude afterthought, reveals a surprising attention to craftsmanship and even personal style. The discovery of eyed bone needles, some dating back over 40,000 years, shows that prehistoric people were not merely draping themselves in animal hides, but tailoring fitted garments, stitched seams, layered furs, and in colder climates, likely waterproofed boots and parkas, remarkably similar in concept to those worn by Arctic peoples today. Beads made from shell, ivory, and bone, sometimes traded across distances of hundreds of miles, decorated clothing and bodies alike, suggesting that personal adornment and even fashion trends existed long before anyone wrote a single word. Trade itself is one of the more startling revelations of recent archaeology. Obsidian tools found far from any volcanic source, seashells discovered hundreds of miles inland, and certain types of flint moved across entire regions, all point to extensive networks of contact and exchange between different bands and tribes. These were not isolated, suspicious little clusters of humans clinging to survival in solitary silence. They were connected, trading not only objects, but very likely stories, songs, technologies, and marriage partners, weaving a web of human relationship across staggering distances, long before roads, writing, or wheels existed.
Social structure within these groups appears, based on burial evidence and modern hunter-gatherer comparisons, to have been markedly more egalitarian than later agricultural societies would become. Resources were typically shared widely. Status seems to have been earned through skill, wisdom, storytelling ability, or generosity, rather than inherited wealth. Elders held deep respect as the living libraries of the group, carriers of botanical knowledge, hunting wisdom, and oral histories that might stretch back generations. Children were raised collectively, often cared for not just by their parents, but by an entire surrounding network of relatives and group members, a pattern still observed today among remaining hunter-gatherer societies, and one that many anthropologists believed shaped fundamental aspects of human psychology and social bonding.
And then there is death, perhaps the most moving window into the emotional interior of prehistoric life. Burial sites, stretching back over 100,000 years, reveal practices that go far beyond simple disposal of remains. Bodies arranged carefully, sometimes curled into a fetal position, sometimes laid flat with arms folded. Red ochre, a mineral pigment, sprinkled across the body, perhaps symbolizing blood, life, or rebirth. Flowers, identified through pollen analysis at sites like Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq, apparently placed alongside Neanderthal remains tens of thousands of years ago. Tools, jewelry, and food placed beside the deceased, suggesting belief in some form of continued existence or journey after death. These were not the actions of creatures driven purely by instinct. These were the actions of people, capable of love, of loss, and of the very human need to mark a life that had ended.
Religion and belief, in whatever early form they took, almost certainly grew from this same soil of wonder and fear. Cave paintings depicting half-human, half-animal figures, sometimes called therianthropes, hint at early spiritual or shamanistic practices, perhaps connected to hunting magic, rites of passage, or attempts to commune with the animal world that sustained human life.
Small carved figurines, like the famous Venus figurines found across a wide swath of Ice Age Europe, with their exaggerated rounded forms, may have represented fertility, motherhood, or some deeper symbolic concept lost to us now, but clearly meaningful enough to be carved with care and carried across long distances.
As the last ice age slowly released its grip on the world, beginning around 15,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. Forests crept back across once frozen tundra, and the great herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses that had sustained human life for so long began to vanish. This was not a sudden apocalypse, but a slow, multi-generational transformation. Communities that had once followed migrating herds across vast distances began settling for longer periods near rivers and lakes, where fish, fowl, and wild plants offered more reliable, less mobile sources of food. It was from this gradual shift, this slow loosening of a way of life that had endured for hundreds of thousands of years, that the first stirrings of agriculture would eventually emerge, around 12,000 years ago, in places like the Fertile Crescent. But that is the beginning of an entirely different chapter in human history, one defined by permanent villages, surplus grain, private property, and eventually, writing and cities. What stays with us from this older, longer chapter of the human story, the one that occupied more than 99% of our species' existence on this planet, is something quietly profound. Long before there were kings or scriptures or written laws, human beings were already painting the walls of their world with wonder, already burying their dead with tenderness, already making music in the dark, already teaching their children games that taught them how to survive and how to belong. The tools were simple, the shelters were modest, but the inner lives unfolding around those ancient fires were rich with everything we still recognize as deeply, unmistakably human: curiosity, creativity, grief, joy, and the quiet comfort of not being alone in the dark.
Across the vast, often silent stretch of prehistory, that is perhaps the truest discovery of all. Not that our ancestors merely survived, but that, in their own way, surrounded by firelight and uncertainty, they found ways to truly live.